Greetings, my name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center at Brandeis University, and it's really a great pleasure to welcome you to our final scholar seminar for this academic year, entitled Jewish Masculinity in the Zionist Ballroom. Our presenter today is Professor Sonia Gollance. She's a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and currently serves as lecturer, which actually means assistant professor in Yiddish at University College London. Her research focuses on Yiddish studies, German Jewish literature and gender studies, performance studies. She's managing editor of a big initiative of the Digital Yiddish Theatre Project entitled Plotting Yiddish Drama, and is best known for her very well titled book entitled It Could Lead to Dancing, Mixed Sex Dancing and Jewish Modernity. It's a wonderful volume published this year by Stanford University Press. And if you don't get the allusion to an old joke, Professor Gollance tells you the joke in the very opening paragraph of her book. She's now involved in a translation translation project and has a fellowship for that. She's developing a big project on Yiddish women playwrights. She will be one of the leading figures going forward in this area of Yiddish studies, and we're particularly pleased to be able to bring her to Schusterman today with this talk on Jewish masculinity in the Zionist ballroom. Welcome, Professor Gollance.
Thank you. Could we get the PowerPoint? Right, thank you. My talk today, and thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Sarna. It's so lovely to be here and to be able to talk about an aspect of my book that I haven't had as much of an opportunity to share with people in public talks. My talk today concerns dance in the service of Zionism. When people consider this topic, they usually think horas and not waltzes. Or in other words, they recall the important role of dance in the development of a new Hebrew culture, a topic that has played a prominent role in Jewish dance research. Dance was crucial in this context. For one thing, it embodied a strong, healthy physicality that was advocated by Zionist leaders such as Max Nordau. Additionally, dance was part of public ceremonies in the Yishuv, the body of Jewish residents in Mandate Palestine, and in the State of Israel, which could help stake the historical claims of the Zionist movement by performing a link to ancient times. Yet my goal today is to show how Zionist ideas could play out in the context of bourgeois social dances that might at first glance seem antithetical to the new Hebrew culture. And today I'm largely going to be focusing on the German literary context. I contend that European ballroom dances can illuminate issues of Jewish masculinity, physicality, and gender relations. 19th and early 20th century social dance was a pastime, social marker, and art form. German language dance manuals emphasized the importance of beautiful movements and posture. And in the next slide, we have an example of one perception of posture in the diaspora by the, thank you. In the words of dance master Franz Wessner, quote, One must pay attention to the posture of the body while standing, walking, and sitting, since nothing clothes a person more unpleasantly than a crooked back posture, a careless walk, and sitting awry." End quote. It was precisely this issue of upright posture and body deportment that made dance a complicated issue for Jews in the era of emancipation, since many Europeans, including European Jews, believed Jewish men lacked proper grace and physical carriage. Reformers, German nationalists, and Zionists all claimed that Jewish men had spent too much time hunched over their Talmud volumes in crowded, unhealthy Jewish quarters. This was the context in which Nordau advocated for the creation of a Muskeljudentum, a Jewry of muscle that would physically revive a Jewish masculinity he viewed as degenerate. Since the discourse around Jewish physical deportment typically concerned masculine fitness, scholars have tended to focus on traditionally male activities, such as gymnastics, dueling, and military service in the creation of what's called the New Jew. Yet the mixed-sex space of the dance floor was also an important place for physical encounters that crossed social boundaries. Could we see the picture on the next slide? Here we have an example of this mixed-sex sociability in ballroom dancing. Social dance was an important form of masculine performance and a token of changing social mores in 19th and 20th century literature. In contrast to other venues for demonstrating masculine physicality, such as military service, social dance required that men prove themselves, not merely to other men, but also to women. As was the case with genteel salon culture, engagement with social dance was a sign of how becoming modern was characterized by participation in mixed-sex leisure culture. Yet unlike the rarefied social circles of the most celebrated salons, social dance was popular across class boundaries. In literature, the dance floor permitted Jewish men to demonstrate their ability to become heads of family through physical dexterity, proper use of etiquette, and fluency in the language of love. Dancing was a crucial way for men to prove their physical suitability when pursuing marriage partners or socializing at community celebrations, at a time when Jews were shifting away from arranged marriages towards companionate marriages, so love matches. Proper performance on the dance floor demanded acculturation in a heterosexual context based on gallantry, flirtation, and notions of romantic love. Social dance was thus further removed from the traditional study house than the homosocial spaces of the dueling society or gymnastics club. In sharp contrast to these other spheres of male achievement, masculinity on the dance floor was defined in relation to women, and it was attained by complimenting them aesthetically and giving them pleasure. Writers in the long 19th century demonstrate a commingled fascination with and anxiety about Jewish men's ability to dance. These concerns are closely identified with notions of courtship and romantic love, as well as with worries about Jewish men's suitability as lovers or marriage partners. While traditional Jewish society privileged male religious scholarship over physical strength or military service, in Jewish literature since the Enlightenment, young women tended to look more fondly on a beau with a secular education and physical abilities, both traits that often implied skill as a dancer. Yet dancing could also be a fraught activity for Jewish men. My talk today emerges from my new book, It Could Lead to Dancing, Mixed-Sex Dancing and Jewish Modernity, which there's a picture of it in the next slide, which was published with Stanford University Press in May 2021. As the title suggests, my book investigates the role of mixed-sex dancing in modern Jewish culture, focusing primarily on dance scenes in German and Yiddish literary texts from the 19th and early 20th centuries. So by dance scenes, I mean literary depictions of people dancing. They could be a whole chapter or just a brief mention. I use the term mixed-sex dancing in my book to show that a lot of concerns about boundary crossing on the dance floor are specifically about men and women partnering together, and I use sex instead of gender because a lot of these concerns ultimately relate to the physical bodies of the dancers instead of whether they identify as male or female. Could we see the next slide? In my book, thank you. In my book, I examine the role of mixed-sex dancing in 5 particular dance spaces: dancing lessons in Chapter 2, taverns in Chapter 3, balls in Chapter 4, weddings in Chapter 5, and the New York immigrant dance culture that was loosely associated with dance halls in Chapter 6. By examining these different dance spaces, I show that dance was everywhere. In rural taverns in Poland, dancing academies in Nuremberg, elite balls in London, and dance halls on the Lower East Side. And we have a picture of that in the next slide, I think. Or no. Overview. Over the next 35 or so minutes, I'll introduce you to some of the main arguments of my book, explain why mixed-sex dancing is an important metaphor for modernity in Jewish literature, and walk you through a particularly illustrative example of a Zionist ball from a German novel. Finally, I'll conclude with some remarks about balls hosted by Jews where Jews were in the majority. You can have the next slide. Dances appear throughout literature as places for young people to meet, flirt, and form relationships, as any reader of Romeo and Juliet, War and Peace, or Pride and Prejudice can confirm. Dance scenes are a way for writers to criticize societal expectations about courtship while simultaneously entertaining their readers. My book demonstrates that dance is a powerful tool for narrating Jewish social inclusion and exclusion. And in the next slide, we get what I view as a Jewish version of that, the last image. Dance scenes help characters negotiate religious, class, and national boundaries in a transgressive fashion, since the dance floor is a space where individuals can meet and form relationships with dance partners who are not regarded as acceptable marriage partners. Dance scenes are particularly important in literary texts from the 19th and early 20th centuries, which discuss how Jews tried to integrate into European society. Dance plays an important role in debates about Jewish acculturation, especially since Jewish law prohibits men and women from dancing together. Literary depictions of Jewish mixed-sex dancing demonstrate the sheer variety of perspectives on Jewish emancipation and ideas about Jewish modernity, and show how these concerns are related to ideas about Jewish bodies. My talk traces a popular but largely unexamined trope of modern Jewish culture that transcends class, gender, and national boundaries, because everyone's dancing. The first book to focus on European Jewish social dance, It Could Lead to Dancing, analyzes literary and cultural representations of mixed-sex dancing, focusing on German and Yiddish literature. My book shows the specific literary qualities of dance scenes, such as the way that dances aid in plot and character development. I also identify parallels between dance figures and plot structures. In other words, a book with a circular dance might also have a sense of repetition or coming full circle at the end. I also pay close attention to the broader social repercussions of Jewish dance. While contemporary popular culture often portrays Jewish mixed-sex dancing as either absolutely forbidden in an Orthodox context or as the punchline of a dirty joke, dance provided 19th and early 20th century writers with a powerful metaphor that could be employed with great versatility. Writers use dance scenes to showcase their protagonists' explorations of their social boundaries and sexual possibilities. Dance gives expression to unruly desires in a deceptively permissive space, yet when the dancing stops, the dominant social structures remain enforced, and characters who do not adapt their passions often suffer tragic consequences. Dance is crucial in German Jewish and Yiddish literature because it conveys the temptations of non-Jewish culture across gender and class lines, revealing the way that Jewish modernity was often a story of Jewish participation in mixed-sex leisure activities. We get another picture in the next slide. Great, thanks. Between the late 18th and early 20th centuries, a shift appears to have taken place in attitudes towards the prohibition on mixed-sex dancing. Jewish participation in transgressive dancing was not a new phenomenon. Rabbis had been prohibiting mixed-sex dancing, and Jewish communities had been finding ways around the restrictions for centuries. Yet while earlier Jewish writings on the topic tended to emphasize the threat of sexual impropriety within a Jewish communal context, such as adultery, starting around 1780, there was a greater concern, particularly in literary fiction, with the relationship between improper dancing and the violation of religious or class boundaries. In short, improper dancing was understood to reveal the influence of values from outside the traditional community, and such behavior demanded a fitting response. Modernity offered Jews new social possibilities outside of their religious communities, and these options for social mobility were quite literally embodied on the dance floor. Dance became an important metaphor for the process of acculturation in literary texts, coinciding with three historical phenomena, which should be on the next slide. Okay, so we have one, greater Jewish integration in non-Jewish society, two, the evolving concept of companionate marriage, love matches, and three, the increased popularity of intimate partner dances across social classes. Dances such as the waltz involved extensive physical contact and provided more opportunities for dance partners to individualize their interaction on the dance floor rather than relying on the directives of a dance master. Jewish participation in the ballroom was, for many writers, a symbol of Jewish engagement with modern society more broadly. And as we'll see, Zionism was one of these modern ideas. In the period following the Enlightenment, religious communities were forever changed by the growth of secularism, and Jewish communities in particular grappled with acculturation, religious reform, nationalism, and political emancipation. Even within a Jewish communal context, interpretations of Jewish law did not necessarily carry the same force as in previous generations, and it was necessary for authorities to appeal to such communal concerns as Jewish continuity, anti-Semitism, the family, and bourgeois propriety. Writers of Jewish popular fiction, whether they were religiously inclined or staunchly secular, portrayed mixed-sex dancing as a threat to the social order. However, not all mixed-sex dancing was equally subject to criticism. We have another slide. Dances in bourgeois German Jewish social clubs, or as we see here, among Yiddish-speaking immigrants on New York's Lower East Side, may have just seemed like new popular fun. Although these types of dances represented a new form of courtship, one which fostered love matches rather than arranged marriages, they did not necessarily challenge the composition of the matches themselves, since participants in these social events were generally in the same class, educational, or religious group. The real controversy occurred in life and certainly in literature when individuals danced with, flirted with, and maybe even married those whom their families and communities would not have considered an appropriate match. As such, literary depictions of mixed-sex dancing typically involve multiple forms of social mixing. They concern dance partners of different genders, but also involve transgressions of religious, class, or ethnic boundaries. We have another slide here. It is no coincidence that such anxiety about mixed-sex dancing coincided with the period of Jewish acculturation and emancipation, since social dancing was arguably the most popular and intimate mixed-sex leisure activity. It was, moreover, an important way for young people to display their obedience to the rules of fashion and etiquette while seeking out a marriage partner. Mixed-sex dancing was, in short, a key way for both sexes, in different ways, to show their commitment to modern social norms and to display this commitment within the context of courtship. The stakes were, therefore, potentially quite high for the community, the family, and the individual him or herself. Writers often negotiated the thorny process of Jewish cultural engagement by putting Jews on the dance floor and describing what happens when they encounter an unsuitable dance partner. Yet the tales of these Jewish dancers often end tragically precisely because authors could not envision a successful resolution for them. Jewish women were particularly vulnerable to ill-fated love affairs, since an advantageous marriage was their main form of social mobility in the literary imagination, if not necessarily in reality. The fatal mismatch between the utopian fantasy suggested by the dance floor and a society that was unprepared to deal with a controversial match meant that Jewish dancers could not find a proper place for themselves. As a result, the delights of the dance floor often led to tragic consequences. We have another slide here as well. In literature, the dance floor is a microcosm of Jewish integration into broader society, whether in Europe or in the United States. Dance scenes convey the appeal of a mixed-sex leisure pursuit in a seemingly permissive setting, yet also reveal the limited options for actual social mobility. Despite these overall patterns, individual scenes vary in terms of social context, type of dance, amount of description, and precise nature of engagement with non-Jewish culture. In literary plots, dance scenes embody the problems of modern Jews in a manner that was designed to appeal to readers. Okay, so now we're going to get into this novel with the Zionist ball scene. And we have another slide here. Okay, so I'm now going to focus on analyzing a Zionist ball scene in a serialized novel from the World War I era German Jewish press, and how it conveys Jewish male anxiety on the dance floor. This anxiety is heightened by the gender expectations of social dance. Men and women had separate and clearly delineated roles in the ballroom, and in contemporary social dance spaces, there is an effort to make some of these rules more fluid, to refer to the lead and the follow instead of the man and the woman, etc., etc. But in this particular context, it's still quite, we're still dealing with a very rigid gender binary in this context. Men were expected to pay attention to their female dance partners without making inappropriate advances. At the same time, women had the right to refuse a dance or to favor one man over another. Jewish men might feel particularly sensitive about rejected dance invitations if these slights reminded them of barriers they faced to successful integration. Such is the case in Clementine Sophie Kramer's short novel Der Weg des jungen Hermann Kahn, The Path of Young Hermann Kahn, which was serialized in 1918 in the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums, the Universal Journal of Jewry. And in the next slide, we actually have information about her and a picture. So Kramer was born in Rheinsbischofsheim in Baden, Germany in 1873. She moved to Munich after her marriage, where she became active as a feminist and pacifist. Kramer wrote prolifically in a variety of genres, and she published in both the Jewish and general German press. Despite her attempts to immigrate from Germany, Kramer was unable to leave Nazi Germany before the outbreak of World War II, and she died of dysentery in Theresienstadt in 1942. Her two serialized novels about Jewish topics reveal the way that acculturated Jewish men and women negotiate German society and dance floors. Although Kramer was virtually forgotten for decades, recent scholarship by Elizabeth Lontz and Carrie Wallach has drawn more attention to her work. Lontz notes in particular the way that Kramer's Jewish novels depict the author's sense of German identity at a time when Zionism was not yet popular among German Jews, which Lontz characterizes as, quote, the belief that German Jews had a legitimate claim to the German homeland and identity based on their affinity for German culture, their rootedness in the German landscape, and not least their German culture and mother tongue, albeit with the acknowledgement that a reciprocal German-Jewish symbiosis remained incomplete, end quote. Kramer's character Hermann ultimately articulates this view in a speech at a Zionist club. And in the next slide, we have bit more information about this, this novel and a picture of the publication that it was in. So The Path of Hermann Kahn is a Bildungsroman that tells the story of a Jewish boy from a small town in Germany who becomes a medical student in Heidelberg. Throughout the novel, he wrestles with his German-Jewish male identity and the question about whether to throw his lot with the Zionist movement or to attempt to make a life for himself in Germany. Late in the novel, Hermann attends a Heidelberg Zionist ball, where the Jewish woman in whom he is smitten rebuffs him. Although Hermann is fascinated by ardently Zionist student Salome Fingerhut, his commitment to living in Germany is a point of contention for such a politically active Zionist woman. Her sudden dismissal becomes even more complete when she instead decides to dance with Hermann's Christian friend, Lieutenant Horst Bäumke, even though she had previously urged Hermann to consider, quote, the race, unquote, before rejecting Jewish nationalism. Her own concerns about the race, it seems, do not involve strict adherence to endogamy. The Zionist ball is thus a location where flirtation and romantic rivalry reveal tensions between German Jewish identity, Zionism, and assimilation. Salome stars in the ball's opening pageant, which allows her to display her ardent Zionism and depict herself as a paragon of Jewish nationalist femininity. Yet at the same time, Salome dances with a Christian lieutenant instead of one of her Jewish admirers, which leads Hermann to question her true commitment to the Zionist cause. Jewish organizations hosted balls for philanthropic purposes and to celebrate particular occasions, including Purim. In this context, it is hardly surprising that Zionist groups also held balls. Starting in the late 19th century, Zionist organizations in cities across Europe hosted holiday balls, which often celebrated the holidays of Hanukkah and Purim. Yet Zionist balls presented a particular paradox because they supported Jewish nationalism through a form of leisure culture that was unabashedly European and bourgeois, despite the socialist and agricultural leanings of Zionist youth organizations like Hashomer Hatzair, the Young Guard. Can we see another slide? Yeah. During the 1920s and 30s, public Purim balls in Tel Aviv, often complete with costumed processions and the election of a Queen Esther, were designed to showcase the new Hebrew culture. Dancer and painter Baruch Agadati, who's pictured in the next slide, organized lavish Purim balls, beginning with a 1921 costume ball for 500 elite guests who paid for their tickets. According to Hitzi Shoham, quote, "In a way, this celebrity event, the first of its kind in Tel Aviv, returned the ball's genre from the community event to the pre-modern aristocratic format," end quote. And we'll see some of that idea of pre-modern aristocracy in the novel as well. In writing about the 1937 National Dance Competition in Tel Aviv, Nina S. Spiegel explains that members of the Yishuv faced several contradictions in their quest to create a Hebrew theatrical dance form. And we have an image from Spiegel's book in the next slide. They aspired to a style that was artistic according to European views, quote, choreographed, skillfully executed, evocative of European modern dance conventions during this period, end quote, but at the same time it was also, quote, authentically Middle Eastern, Jewish, evocative of biblical times or of their new life in Palestine, end quote. Although folk dances did not have the prestige of modern theatrical dance, the circular hora was ubiquitous at Zionistic gatherings where mixed-sex groups of young people performed a dance that, by the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, quote, had become a quintessential marker of a new Jewish society, end quote. The new Hebrew body culture was defined according to European values and notions of Jewish authenticity, yet the European social dances that Jews had, in many cases, only recently embraced were not given the same weight as modern dance, folk dance, or even ballet. In this context, Zionist balls were a way for Jews in the diaspora to show their support for the idea of a Jewish state, yet they did so using a style of dance that may have seemed incongruous to chalutzim, pioneers, in the Yishuv. Kramer's depiction of the ball's opening pageant emphasizes monarchy, hierarchy, and ordered pairs, concepts that, as Shoham observed, seem far removed from the values of the Yishuv. The pageant portrays the biblical story of the meeting of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Not surprisingly, Salome plays the famous queen, a wise and prosperous monarch in the biblical account who helped Solomon prove his magnificent, yet who was later identified with the demon Lilith in post-biblical writings and depicted as a threatening dancer in Ashkenazic folklore. The reenactment at the ball is preceded by a prologue in verse that narrates the sad history of Jewish exile since the time of Solomon, saying that the diaspora Jew, quote, lives in dark shadows, end quote. Yet although these words demean European Jewish life, the royal couple leads a procession in a polonaise and waltz two dances that were derived from Central European folk dances and were frequently performed at noble balls. So I'm going to read a quote, but it's also on the next slide. The procession moved through the hall, the king and queen at the head, followed by the entire court appropriately organized in pairs. The onlookers joined in the polonaise, and then the music changed to a waltz, and the couples swayed and spun around, the king and queen at the head. Kramer's repetition of the phrase, the king and queen at the head, underscores the preeminence of the two dancers who were selected as the royal couple. They have been chosen as paradigms of Zionist ideals and thus lead the other guests around in a grand march comprised of a line of couples. None of the novel's characters object to being part of a royal court. Indeed, most German Jews, especially when the story was published in the last months of World War I, could only partake in court pageantry at a Jewish ball, if at all. In a certain sense, this spectacular ball opening, complete with verse, masquerade, and procession, resembles German early modern court entertainments. Claudia Schnitzer notes in her study of such festivities that even costumed amusements functioned to formalize each person's position in the court hierarchy. Zalomea's Zionism is not merely a Jewish form of European nationalism, it is a Jewish appropriation of European displays of kingship, used in service of an anticipated Jewish nation-state. As the waltz ends, Kramer wryly comments about how the, quote, royal personages, end quote, mix with the, quote, common people, end quote. The very first commoner she mentions is Hermann, who rushes over to Salomea. Much to his surprise, since they had previously been friendly, Salomea treats him disdainfully, as if she were actually a queen. When he eagerly asks her for the next dance, she scolds him haughtily and says, rather petulantly, quote, "You threw that opportunity away 8 days ago. Next time you should wake up earlier, Herr Kahn," end quote. Hermann persists by asking her to partner him for the first Française, another European ballroom dance. Salomea taunts him by brandishing her first dance card. And we have a picture of a dance card just to see what they look like, or what one could look like. And then hers is one that has where it's a list of lines where you could have dance partners could reserve their spot for dances by writing down with a pencil where which dance they're partnering her for. And so she brandishes a full dance card, quote, entirely inscribed with names and student circles, end quote, which suggests that she may have let young men reserve dances with her before the pageant even began. Although Salomea has the right to decide with whom she will spend her time and which admirers she will permit to handle her body, the way she treats Hermann is deliberately hurtful. Quote, "If a dance gets squeezed in," she made herself gracious, "then maybe," end quote. Earlier, Salomea chided Hermann for his lack of Zionist enthusiasm, and she now punishes him for that political apathy, or, as Hermann suspects, for neglecting her by recently visiting his mother in his native village, by refusing to dance with him. Hermann's humiliation soon turns into jealousy. On a whim, because the ball invitation particularly encouraged male guests to attend, he invited his friend Boimke, in part to see how the Christian officer would respond to Zionist politics. Unfortunately, however, by taking Boimke with him, he has unwittingly brought along a romantic rival. When Boimke approaches Salomea and gallantly asks to be introduced to the, quote, queen, end quote, she, quote, raised her eyes in surprise and did not attempt in the slightest to disguise how pleased she was by the young officer, end quote. Boimke treats Salomea with grandiose respect, allowing her to continue her fantasy of being royalty. Yet Salomea's interest in her new admirer defies the rules of etiquette. When Hermann later sees her clinging to Boimke's arm for the Française, she explains that she, quote, shifted, end quote, her promised dance partner to dance with Boimke instead. And this is a big violation of the rules, the etiquette rules of the ballroom. Her condescending description of her slighted dance partner as a kleines Jungerchen, a small little boy, emphasizes Bäumke's strong military stature, as she praises him at the expense of yet another Jewish man. Salomea's political conviction seems to wither in the face of Bäumke's good looks, since the Christian officer has no particular interest in the Zionist cause. Either Salome is willing to make exceptions to her beliefs for particularly appealing men, or her Zionism is a thinly veiled European nationalism that considers a non-Jewish officer as compelling as a Jewish one. While Hermann's professional training as a doctor might have appealed to a bourgeois woman, such cultivation does not satisfy a Zionist who longs for signs of physical manliness, which she can test out for herself on the dance floor. Quote, her eyes kept hanging adoringly on Bäumke's splendid form, and that man was undeniably the lion of the evening, end quote. The queen of the Zionist ball has chosen a blonde Christian man as her partner, a move that suggests that, even at Zionist events, German Jewish men must contend with threats to their masculinity. While Salome proclaims her commitment to Zionism, Kramer's narrative undercuts her seeming idealism. The ball scene suggests, in short, that Salome is ideologically inconsistent. Hermann's mother previously claimed, when explaining why she thought Salome's Zionist views would not prevent her from marrying Hermann, that young women often change their deeply held beliefs for love, a theory the ball scene tests. Hermann objects to the way Salome mistreats her Jewish admirers and lets herself be governed by her desire for Bäumke. He resents the fact that a woman who viewed his ideological leanings as a barrier to their union quickly forgets any reservations about flirting with a man who is not even a member of the, quote, race, unquote, and he speculates grimly that she will give up her ideals entirely to become Bäumke's wife or mistress, since, quote, a young girl cannot always remain excited merely for a distant ideal, end quote. Salome is first presented as an independent, intelligent woman who is committed to her political beliefs. She studies Hebrew and is active in the Zionist cause. She is, in short, the type of female character one might expect from an author who is politically engaged herself, although in feminism and pacifism rather than Zionism. Yet in the ball scene, Kramer suggests Salome is more interested in men, or power over them, than in a political cause. It is not surprising that her, quote, almost chic, end quote, name, Salome, invokes the notorious Princess Salome from the Gospels, who performed a seductive dance to convince her lustful stepfather, King Herod of Judea, to kill John the Baptist. While Salome advocates for a Jewish nation and disparages Hermann for choosing to stay in Germany, her Zionism reenacts oft-repeated European cultural tropes. Scholars such as Michael Stanislavski demonstrate that founding Zionist leaders were indelibly influenced by European ideas and draw connections between Zionist body culture, spurred by the ideal of the healthy muscular new Jew, and European nationalism. Stanislavski notes that for Zionist leaders, Theodor Herzl and Max Nordau, and this is on the next slide as well, at least as insidious as the ghetto Jew was the bourgeois Jew, represented as a fat and effeminate cigar-smoking capitalist with a carefully coiffed wife or mistress on his arm, or as a deracinated German or Austrian Jewish student, intellectual, lawyer, or journalist at home in the coffee house and lecture hall, but cut off entirely from nature, from military life, from real manhood. Although social critics have recognized the ways in which Central and Eastern European Jews established an Ashkenazic elite in the Yishuv and State of Israel, Kramer was more interested in how Zionists interacted with other German Jews, whom they might dismiss in a manner reminiscent of Herzl and Nordau. In her character Salome, Kramer offers the example of a fictional female Zionist and questions the depth of her convictions. Salome's behavior reveals her ideological inconsistency, since she does not allow her politics to disrupt her obvious attraction to Bäumke. Salome's actions lead Hermann to reevaluate his process of acculturation, and he soon pursues a new non-Jewish partner of his own. Salome exercises her feminine power at the ball in ways that might not have been available to her in other settings. Zionist ideology stressed the pursuit of a martial, physical Jewish masculinity, which meant women such as Salome had a more circumscribed role than in the contemporaneous activities of the political left. In her study of Jewish women in fin de siècle Vienna, Alison Rose characterizes the gender dynamics in the Zionist movement as one which limited women's participation outside the domestic sphere. And this quote is in the next slide. The Zionist movement concentrated on distancing itself from perceived traditional gender relationships of the East European shtetl, in which the physically weak, yet at the same time privileged due to his access to Jewish learning, Jewish man, was dominated by his strong-willed and worldly wife. In contrast, Zionism criticized the bourgeois Jewish woman for not working for the Zionist movement, as well as for failing to attend to the Jewish religious and cultural needs of the family. In this sense, Zionists idealized the domestic attributes of the traditional Jewish woman. Indeed, while Zalamea puts her body on display at the pageant, it is Hermann who later gets to prove himself through his words at a Zionist meeting by giving a speech in defense of German Jewish identity. Zalamea disappears from the story as soon as she is no longer a viable romantic prospect for Hermann, and it is unclear if she even attended his speech. At the ball, however, Zalamea can be queen and decide with which of her admirers she will dance. She even tests out her attraction to Boehmke in corporeal yet socially sanctioned ways. Nonetheless, it seems unlikely that she actually becomes his wife or lover. When Boehmke next appears, he is kissing another woman. His flirtation with Zalamea was presumably of short duration and may have simply been confined to one social event. In attending the ball, Hermann encounters Zionist and German non-Jewish threats to his self-esteem as a German Jewish man. By using the female right of refusal at the Zionist ball, Zalamea undermines the traditional Jewish commitment to endogamy while reifying the social status of a Christian German officer. So I'm going to conclude now. So in the next slide, the ball scene in the path of young Hermann Kahn illustrates the way that the social and political issues confronting Jews in the 19th and early 20th centuries could play out in literary dance scenes and a ballroom setting. I'd like to conclude now with a few remarks about balls and dances hosted by Jews, since these spaces were often established to allow Jews a social experience where they were in the majority. Participants in Jewish balls tended to share a similar acculturated bourgeois Jewish background, which meant that parents who wanted their children to find partners with a common class and religious background were less likely to object to their children becoming romantically involved with their dance partners at such events. As a result, authors tend not to discuss the taboo on mixed-sex dancing in the context of Jewish balls. At the same time, such events reveal divisions within the community and the way that Christian guests further destabilize these dynamics. And I have a picture of that in the next slide. Issues such as wealth, degree of acculturation, marital status, and political affiliation could create tensions that reverberate onto the dance floor. Scenes at both Jewish and non-Jewish balls show that individual dancers are unable to fully overcome existing hierarchies, as we can see in Zalamea's preference for Christian military man over Jewish men she treats dismissively. While Jewish dancers who attend non-Jewish balls often experience a momentous encounter with a dance partner they naively hope will become a viable spouse, Jewish dancers at Jewish balls frequently confront the reality that dancing to music ultimately will not change their personal circumstances. It is for such reasons that a Zionist ball is such a useful literary device for highlighting the gendered insecurities of German Jewish men, concerns which will continue to play out in subsequent decades in the development of the new Hebrew physical culture and Israeli dance. Thank you. And I have a concluding slide.
Oh, so much, Sonia. Thank you so much for this. I have a lot of thoughts swirling around in my head right now, mainly about what this adds to my understanding of Bridgerton, which is actually quite a lot. But I want to start with the amazing questions that are coming in, and you still have time to send them in, and I will try to get to as many as possible. You spoke a little bit about this sort of tangentially, but I wanted if you could talk a bit about the femininity of Jewish women. Is that a same sort of concern in the literature that you're reading? And also, I'm going to pair these together because I think they're relevant. when we start, let's say, moving to thinking about Mandate Palestine and what eventually becomes the state of Israel, how is the masculinity of Mizrahi men, right, and Sephardic men discussed in this context?
So I think there's a lot to say about masculinity of Mizrahi men. I think that other scholars might be better able to address that point. But I definitely do encounter these stereotypes and expectations of Jewish women in Europe in my book. When Jewish men there were a lot of concerns that Jewish men were unable to dance well, but Jewish women, it was just assumed, were able to dance. And they were often sort of sexualized and sort of treated as being sexually available and vulnerable and exotic. You get in a lot of European literature, for instance, The Merchant of Venice and Ivanhoe and Daniel Deronda, you get this idea of the beautiful Jewess. And this was this like archetype of the sexually desirable Jewish woman who was viewed as being trapped by the circumstances of her patriarchal culture.
I wanted to ask about sort of, and I think you've alluded to this, the question of Jewish versus non-Jewish writers, right? So obviously, you know, non-Jewish writers are also writing ballroom scenes, right? This is something that shows up again and again and again in this kind of literature that you're studying. And is there a way in which, when Jewish writers write about it, right, is there something sort of instinctively Jewish about it, right? Does that question make sense? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the position. Most of the writers that I address in this book were Jewish, but not all of them. And some of the attitudes of the non-Jewish authors were very interesting. So for instance, one writer that I write about quite a lot because he is really interesting is Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, who was a liberal Austrian nobleman who's probably best known today for a particular preference which was named for him, namely masochism. And so he wrote about domineering women wearing fur. This was a particular preference of his. And he wrote also about domineering Jewish women who were wearing fur and would do things like organize beating up anti-Semites or engage in Talmudic disputes with sexist men and things like that. And so one scholar writing about him basically says that he viewed intermarriage as this like delightful way to annoy anti-Semites. And he's accused of having a mostly aesthetic interest in Judaism, whereas some of these Jewish writers were like, they were really trying to change people's minds or really depict the social position of Jews. And he does that to some extent, but a lot of it is this sort of, in this sort of exoticism context. Another author that I mention is Maria Edgeworth, who wrote a novel, Harrington, that was basically, she had written a novel with a negative Jewish character, and she gets a letter from a Jewish woman that was basically like, why are you being so mean to Jews? Could you like be a little bit nicer to us? And she's like, okay, I'm going to write a novel that is sympathetic to Jews, except actually it's like really problematic because it turns out that the beautiful Jewish woman is not actually Jewish, so then she can like marry the reformed anti-Semite hero. So there's some issues with it there too. But she does also like include a brief reference to like this Jewish woman who's going to a ball, and it's seen that she's like she's seen as a very attractive possible dance partner. So yeah, so those are some of these issues that come up.
We got a question right about fashion, right? Obviously, you know, in addition to dancing, especially what the women are wearing is a big part of this. So, right, do these Jewish women, you know, whether it's in the literary descriptions or sort of maybe the descriptions of the actual dances, Do we know what they're wearing? Do they have relationships with certain designers like Charles Worth, etc.? And how does that play into this?
Well, when Soccer Mouse Sock writes about them, they're wearing fur. It's a really interesting question. I don't remember so many extensive discussions of fashion. That's something that I might want to look into now, especially since I find fashion and clothing to be they're interesting in a lot of ways. But I don't. I mean, one of the things that I found in my research is that a lot of times I'm dealing with a lot of things that are ambiguous or unsaid. Like a lot of times the descriptions don't say what the dance is, or they don't really provide a lot of detail about the movement. So a lot of it is just sort of figuring out, based on interactions, what the dance is doing. And sometimes I can't quite tell all of the details, but I am able to see how the dynamics between characters change, or something about how the authors are perceiving the space of the dance floor, even if they don't go into detail, either because they don't find it necessary, or because like everybody knows what's going on, or because they're not necessarily interested in all of those details. They're mostly interested in just the overall ambiance.
I want to raise a question, and I think you've alluded to this already by talking about circle dances and sort of folk dances, is that often, at least there's this idea, or we're taught this idea of equality in the sexes in Zionism. Everyone working, everyone together. And even though we know that idea played out in reality, or played out differently in reality, I wanted to ask you how that's squared with some of your research on social dancing. And I'll just add an anecdote, I think, to illustrate this, is that B'nai Akiva, which is the religious Zionist youth movement in Israel, allows mixed dancing, generally speaking. But one of the discussions, when you look into especially the early documents, they say we allow mixed dancing because we do folk dancing and circle dancing, right? We don't do, which is not problematic in the same way that partner dancing is, or what you might call social dancing. So I was wondering if you just comment on that clash as you see it playing out in dance culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think in sort of like some of the East European social dances that are in circles, like I tend to think of that as really being about like heightening the sense of community feeling, which comes up in a number of texts. But then also in that context, the people that are doing partner dances or square dances tend to be women, whereas men would be more likely to be doing solo or circle dances. But that B'nai Akiva example is like really interesting. There's I know that Walter Zev Feldman talks about how there might have been less of a sense of taboo about certain dances that were maybe involve switching partners, so you don't have this extensive contact between two people. So like a pachtanz, which is a dance where you it's sort of like a clapping dance, and that might be seen as less transgressive. And then, of course, when you have dances like the waltz or the polka, I think it's most famous with the waltz, but these dances that are seen as just so intimate, because it's not even like the sorts of country dances that you often see in Jane Austen films, and what you should probably see in Bridgerton if they were aspiring to accuracy with the dance.
I gotta hire you for season 3.
I have a piece I'm trying to shop around that relates to my book.
We'll talk. I'll have my people talk to Shanta later.
But in these like country dances, like you don't have this sort of the same sort of intimacy. Like everyone's doing the same choreography and they're doing it in these lines, and they're sort of not always just like two people together doing their own thing in this whirling around and getting dizzy and clinging to each other. I mean, that becomes extremely intense. So I can see why there would be a sense of a distinction from that sort of dance, which does really create this sort of sense of like intimacy and potential attraction.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you did your research, right? Like you mentioned that a lot of these texts are not necessarily well known. I remember hearing stories from you of tracking down copies and things like that. So how did you even find these things? How did you, how did you know where to look, right? What was doing research for this project like?
It was an interesting treasure hunt. I mean, some of it was just I would read things and I would find examples, and then I would sort of get a sense that, oh, if you had certain sorts of texts that were your popular middlebrow fiction, where they were like where you had courtship and there would be weddings, that often it would show up there. Or I would know that if I was looking at social histories, there might not be dance in the index, but if I looked up like weddings, then there might be information there. But also I would just talk to people. I would go to conferences and just like accost scholars in my field and explain what I was working on and ask them to give me their dance scenes, and that worked really well. People were very generous with that. It's been interesting. Like, I've been working on this project for close to a decade, and some of the OCR resources for different sources have gotten much better. So for instance, Compact Memory, which is this like great database of German Jewish periodicals. And so that's actually where I was able to find this story, or this novel, like that became much more text searchable, which was like both good and bad, because initially I could just like look up dance or tance, and then there weren't that many hits yet. So I just like found this story that was great, and I just like wrote an article about it. And then a few years later I look and there's just like so many sources, so I can't read everything that's there, but I did find some like really interesting examples. So things like that were helpful. But it's tricky because like I think sometimes because dance is often seen today as feminine instead of ubiquitous, or because of the connection with the body, that it's not necessarily seen as serious. Like there are certain databases that don't necessarily have it. Like for instance, I went to one archive, one German Jewish Studies archive, and I looked up Tanz, which means dance, and all of the books that were published in Konstanz came up, and nothing that was actually about dance. And also like there was one database of oral history testimonies that had that was large enough that I couldn't just go through everything myself, and it had music and theater as search terms, but not dance. So I was like, okay, this is probably not going to be that helpful unless I see that there was a choreographer that was interviewed.
All very telling about both like the bonuses and the challenges of online research and digitization and how the biases work in. We got a question, right? How do the portrayals of dance in memoirs compare with belles letters? So like what we would describe as sort of like more public writing, right? Or do you look at diaries, right? How are the portrayals different when they're sort of more inward versus outward? And of course, that gets even more complicated when you think about, novels being serialized in newspapers and things like that.
It's an interesting question. I think I tend to rely on memoirs more for trying to document like how some of the mechanics of how dance happened socially. Like for instance, I have a chapter on dance lessons, and a lot of materials that I have are for memoirs where they were saying, this is how I learned to dance. This is, we had like for instance, in a lot of these German memoir accounts, they would say like, okay, so first the boys and girls learned separately so that they would know the steps before they learned together, so nobody would be embarrassed. There was a lot about trying to avoid embarrassment in these German accounts of how people learned to dance. So like that, so that was really useful. For the literary texts, I found most useful in seeing sort of like how it was presented as a way of creating character development, and like how it could be seen as something that could titillate readers. So that was sort of more of the dramatic potential of the dance floor.
And I think that's such a good example of how, me coming from history, how these literary texts can be read in different ways and for different uses depending on, sort of what you want to get out of them. It's interesting that you mentioned embarrassment as a product of the American Deep South. We actually had a line dancing unit in my gym classes in middle school and high school. And maybe, I don't know if it was separate genders, but let's just say I still remember as one of the most embarrassing parts of my life, and a lot of, awkward feelings. But I want to thank Sonia again so much today for her really fascinating talk. I want to thank all of you who came, all of you participated with us for this programming. I want to mention that we have one more meeting next week, which is our final program of the year of the Sephardic Modernity series. I know there was questions in the comments to talk more about Mizrahi masculinity, so I hope you'll tune into that. And there'll be a recording of this on our website in a couple of days, and check out our social media. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a great day.